In 1917, Henry Ford built a tractor so cheap it put 25 million horses out of work. It also flipped over backward and killed farmers. Regularly. Ford's solution: tell them they were driving it wrong. So, here's the thing about America in the early 1900s. The country ran on horses. Not figuratively, literally. 25 million of them by 1920, pulling plows, dragging harrows, hauling wagons of grain and hay from one end of the farm to the other, sunup to sundown, 6 days a week. Every single one of those animals needed to eat. About 5 acres of productive farmland per horse per year. Oats, hay, fodder, straw. Add it all up across the entire country, and you get 93 million acres of American cropland, roughly 27% of everything being harvested, dedicated not to feeding people, but to feeding the things that helped feed people. 1/4 of the nation's farmable land existed just to keep the workforce alive, and the workforce couldn't even tell you it was tired, but it was. A single horse could plow about 1 acre per day before it needed rest. 1 acre. A 6-horse team, working in tandem, could manage maybe 6 acres in a 10-hour stretch. Then you had to water them, feed them, unharness them, curry them, bed them down. That took about 27 minutes per horse per day, every day, whether the animal worked or not. Multiply that by 6 horses, and you've got nearly 3 hours of daily maintenance before you've even touched a plow or planted a seed. Horses ate 365 days a year. They ate in winter when there was no plowing to be done. They ate when they were sick. They ate when they were old and couldn't pull anymore. A horse could go lame stepping in a gopher hole. It could colic from being watered wrong after a hard day. It could simply die in the field, and you had to deal with that too. And replacing a good draft horse wasn't cheap. A well-trained team could run $300 to $500 in that era, which was serious money when most farm families were scratching by on a few $100s a year in cash income. The average small farmer in America kept somewhere between 4 and 8 horses, and he spent more time caring for those animals than he did on almost any other single activity on the farm, including farming. There was another problem nobody talked about much, but everyone felt. Horses needed roads cleared for them. They needed barns built and maintained. They needed pasture fenced off, pasture that could have been growing wheat or corn. They produced manure, mountains of it, which was useful as fertilizer, but also required constant labor to manage, haul, and spread. And the horse ate whether the weather was good or bad, whether the harvest came in or failed, whether you had cash to buy feed or had to grow it yourself at the expense of a cash crop. A bad year for a farmer was still a full-price year for the horses. You couldn't lay off a horse, you couldn't shut it down and park it until spring. And in cities, where horses pulled delivery wagons and streetcars and fire engines, the situation was worse. New York City at the turn of the century had something like 100,000 working horses, each producing around 20 pounds of manure and a gallon of urine per day. The streets were filthy. Disease spread. The horse economy was reaching its breaking point, and anyone paying attention could see it coming. Henry Ford understood this in his bones. He was born on July 28, 1863, on a farm in Springwells Township, just outside Dearborn, Michigan, 4 weeks after the Battle of Gettysburg. He grew up behind a plow. He walked behind horses through Michigan mud for years, watching his father work himself ragged on a farm that barely broke even. He hated every second of it. Years later, he wrote that his earliest memory of farming was that, considering the results, there was too much work on the place. That might be the most restrained thing Henry Ford ever said about anything. What he really wanted, what he said out loud to anyone who would listen for the rest of his life, was to lift the burden of farming from flesh and blood and place it on steel and motors. At 16, he left the farm for a Detroit machine shop and never looked back, at least not at the farming part. The memory of the drudgery stayed with him forever. The man was already the most famous industrialist in America by the time he started seriously chasing his tractor dream. The Model T had put the automobile in the hands of ordinary working people. His assembly line at Highland Park had changed manufacturing forever, but Ford never forgot where he came from. 1 foot in industry, 1 foot in the soil, he liked to say, and the foot in the soil kept itching. As early as 1907, Ford built what he called the automobile plow. It was a Model B car engine bolted to some binder wheels and a crude frame. The rear wheels were salvaged from grain binders. The radiator and steering came from the big Model K. It looked absurd. It ran about 40 feet before something broke. But Ford saw something in it. Over the next 8 years, he kept building prototypes. Model T engines strapped to modified frames. Experimental rigs tested at his farm near Dearborn. A few were demonstrated at the Michigan State Fairgrounds in 1915. None of them were ready for production. All of them taught him something. The problem was that Ford Motor Company's board of directors wanted nothing to do with tractors. They were making serious money selling automobiles. The Dodge brothers, Horace and John, who were major shareholders, saw no reason to dilute the company's resources on a side project for farmers. Ford pitched his tractor vision, got rejected, so he did what Henry Ford always did when someone told him no. He went around them, and then he got revenge. In 1917, Ford and his son Edsel incorporated a brand new, completely separate company, Henry Ford and Son, Incorporated. Not Ford Motor Company, a private family venture with its own factory on Brady Street in Dearborn and its own singular mission: build tractors. Ford even threatened to make this new company his primary business going forward, designing entirely new cars and trucks that would compete directly with Ford Motor Company. This threat was credible enough to terrify the minority shareholders. By 1919, Ford had used this leverage to buy out every one of them, including the Dodge brothers. He consolidated ownership in the family, 55% in his name, 42% in Edsel's, 3% in his wife Clara's. Then he merged Henry Ford and Son into Ford Motor Company. The tractor project that the board didn't want had become the weapon that gave Henry Ford total control. Now, here's where the naming gets interesting. There was already a company called the Ford Tractor Company, registered on March 15, 1915, by a group of entrepreneurs in Minneapolis who had paid a company clerk with the surname Ford for the legal use of his name. They had zero connection to Henry Ford. They were banking entirely on the confusion. It was a hustle, pure and simple. Rather than fight it in court, which could take years and generate bad publicity, Ford simply named his machine something else, a contraction of the company name. Henry Ford and Son became Fordson. The design team was led by 2 Hungarian-born engineers, Eugene Farkas and Josef Galamb. Both had worked on the Model T. They knew Ford's philosophy cold. Make it simple, make it light, make it cheap. Make a lot of them fast. The Fordson Model F was their answer, and it was, in its strange and imperfect way, a masterpiece of cost engineering. The engine was a 4-cylinder inline, 4-inch bore, 5-inch stroke, 251 cubic inches of displacement, rated at 20 horsepower at 1,000 RPM, about 10 horsepower actually reaching the drawbar after drivetrain losses. For reference, that's about the output of a good team of horses, but available all day without rest. It ran on kerosene during normal operation but needed gasoline to start, so there was a small auxiliary fuel tank for starting and a main 21-gallon tank for the cheap stuff. The compression ratio was 6:1. The ignition was borrowed straight from the Model T, a coil magneto system that was simple and cheap and mostly reliable. There were no water pumps. Cooling relied on thermosiphon circulation. Hot water rises, cool water sinks, and if the plumbing is right, the coolant circulates on its own. No oil pump either. Splash lubrication. The crankshaft dipped into an oil bath and flung lubricant around the crankcase by sheer rotational force, elegant in theory, terrifyingly dependent on maintaining the right oil level in practice. The air filtration was particularly creative. intake air was bubbled through a tank of water which trapped dust particles before they could reach the cylinders. On dry days, plowing through dusty fields, that water turned to mud within a couple of hours. You'd have to stop, flush the tank, refill it with clean water, and get back to work. The engine literally breathed through a bath. The transmission was a 3-speed constant mesh unit. First gear crawled at about 2¼ miles per hour. Top gear hit roughly 6¼ The worm gear differential handled the final drive reduction to the rear steel wheels, which were 42 inches in diameter with 12-inch faces, fitted with cleats or optional spikes for traction. The whole machine weighed about 2,900 pounds, 63 inches long in the wheelbase, 63 inches wide, 55 inches tall. A compact, dense little brick of iron and ambition. But the real innovation was structural. Farkas figured out how to make the engine block, the transmission housing, and the rear axle casing into stressed members that bolted together to form the tractor's frame. There was no separate chassis, no heavy steel rails running the length of the machine. The powertrain was the skeleton. This eliminated hundreds of pounds of dead weight, dozens of individual parts, and hours of assembly time. It took 30 hours and 40 minutes to convert raw materials into a finished Fordson on Ford's assembly line. 4,000 parts. Done. That unit frame concept would eventually become the standard design principle for every farm tractor built anywhere in the world. Ford held the patent on it. Production officially started on October 8, 1917. But the first Fordsons didn't go to American farmers. World War I was grinding through Europe, and Britain was starving. German U-boats were sinking food convoys in the Atlantic, and the British government desperately needed more food grown on British soil. But there was a problem. British farmhands were dying in the trenches of France and Belgium. The fields were there, the labor was not. So the Ministry of Munitions placed an urgent order for 5,000 tractors. Ford shipped the first 7,000 units across the Atlantic before a single American farmer could buy one. By mid-1918, more than 6,000 Fordsons were already at work in Britain, Canada, and the United States. The tractor that was built to save American farmers from drudgery started its life-saving Britain from starvation. By the spring of 1918, American sales finally opened. Ford's factories were producing 64 tractors per day. By June, 131 per day. By 1920, annual production surpassed 200,000 units. The Fordson seized more than 70% of the entire American tractor market. 70%. International Harvester, which had basically invented the modern tractor business, went from controlling 39% of the market in 1916 to less than half that within 2 years. For a stretch in the early 20s, 3/4 of all tractors rolling off American assembly lines were Fordsons. The secret wasn't raw engineering superiority. The Fordson was competent, but nothing about it was a genuine first in pure farming capability. Other machines plowed deeper. Others handled more diverse field tasks. The secret was price, brand recognition, and the massive dealer network that already existed to sell Model T automobiles and their parts. The Fordson Model F debuted at $750. International Harvester's Titan 1020 sold for over 1,000. Deere's Waterloo Boy ran about $1,050. A team of draft horses cost $300 to $500 to purchase, then consumed 5 acres of feed per animal per year forever, plus veterinary bills, plus grooming, plus shelter, plus eventual replacement when they aged out after about 15 years. The Fordson ate only when it worked. That single economic fact changed everything. If you're enjoying this, hit subscribe. We cover stuff like this every week, okay? Back to it. Then the economy collapsed. The post-war depression of 1920 and 1921 gutted farm commodity prices overnight. Tractor sales cratered across the entire industry. Ford had been building 300 Fordsons a day, running his assembly line at full capacity. Suddenly, dealer lots everywhere were overflowing with machines nobody could afford to buy. Deere & Company had planned production of 40 Waterloo Boy tractors per day for the second half of 1921. They sold 79 total for the entire year. The industry was drowning in inventory and hemorrhaging money. Ford had to move his stock. So in January of 1922, he did something that nearly obliterated every competing tractor manufacturer in America. He slashed the Fordson's price from $625 to $395, below his own manufacturing cost. He openly admitted this. He did it anyway. He had the automobile division to absorb the losses. His competitors had nothing. International Harvester's general manager, a hard-nosed executive named Alexander Legge, got a phone call that February morning he would never forget. Ford had just dropped his price by roughly 40%. Legge immediately cut prices on the Titan $1,020 to $700 and the International $816 to $670. Even with those reductions, his cheapest tractor still cost nearly twice what a Fordson did. Then Legge said something that became legendary. And to make it good, we'll throw in a plow. The tractor wars had officially begun. Harvester dealers launched a nationwide ground campaign. Whenever a salesman caught wind of a pending Fordson sale anywhere in the country, he challenged the farmer and the Ford dealer to a head-to-head plowing contest. No prizes, no judges, no formal rules. 2 tractors in a field, each pulling a 2-bottom plow with 14-inch bottoms through whatever soil conditions the farmer chose. The harvester machines were heavier, more powerful, and usually outperformed the Fordson in raw fieldwork, but they cost twice as much. As Cyrus McCormick III wrote about this era, a harvester challenge rang through the land. No quarter was given, and none was asked. Grimly, the protagonists struggled. Fiercely, they battled for each sale. The carnage was everywhere, except the fields. In boardrooms and small factory towns across the Midwest, tractor companies were dying. In 1908, about 6 firms made tractors in America. By 1915, that number had exploded to roughly 150 manufacturers, all chasing the mechanization revolution. After Ford dropped to $395, the vast majority of them simply ceased to exist. They couldn't cut costs fast enough, they couldn't match the volume. They folded, merged, or quietly padlocked their doors. By the mid-1920s, the American tractor industry had been reduced to a handful of survivors: Ford, International Harvester, John Deere, J.I. Case, Alice Chalmers. Practically everyone else was gone. Ford sold 35,000 Fordsons in 1921, 67,000 in 1922, over 100,000 in 1923. Over the full Model F production run, from 1917 to 1928, roughly 755,000 units were built across Dearborn and Cork, Ireland, 850,000 total, across the full Fordson lineage, including later English production. Now, the dark side, because the Fordson had one, and it was deadly. Early models had no brakes, none at all. The worm gear's high friction ratio meant power generally only transmitted in one direction, so when you backed off the throttle, the machine gradually stopped. To actually bring it to a halt quickly, you pushed in the clutch. That was your braking system, a pedal and a prayer. No parking brake, no emergency stop, nothing. In the original design, the worm drive sat on top of the differential, right beneath the driver's seat. During heavy pulling, friction generated so much heat that sitting on the tractor became physically unbearable. Ford's engineers relocated the worm to the bottom of the housing. Problem solved, except it created a new one. The relocation changed the torque reaction through the drivetrain in a way that actively lightened the front wheels under load. And that design decision killed people. When the plow hit a rock, a buried stump, or anything immovable, the rear wheels kept trying to rotate, but with the implement locked in place, the tractor had nowhere to go but up. The front end lifted off the ground. And because the Fordson had a short 63-inch wheelbase, a relatively tall and narrow profile, and a redesigned worm drive that was already reducing front-wheel loading under heavy draft, the entire machine could rotate backward around the rear axle faster than any human being could possibly react. The point of no return came in under 1 second. Full rear overturn took about 1.5 seconds. The tractor landed on its back. The driver landed underneath it. They called it the Widowmaker. That was not a joke. That was a warning. The Eastern Implement Dealer reported 36 driver deaths in 1918 alone, the very first year of production. A publication called Pips Weekly tallied 136 men killed by Fordsons by August of 1922. Ford's corporate spokesman offered the same response every time. The accidents resulted from inexperienced operators. Any tractor could be dangerous if improperly handled, which was technically accurate, also completely useless to the families burying their husbands and fathers. One Indiana farmer declared the Fordson should be banned by law. A farmer near Atlanta kept a diary through 1921 cataloging the machine's relentless failures, engine breakdowns, broken wheels, the rear end literally bursting apart. His repair bill for that single year exceeded $1,200, roughly 3 times what the tractor had cost at the lowest sale price. A Colorado rancher telephoned his Fordson dealer 3 times a day, every day, to report the latest malfunction. Some desperate owners poured concrete into the front wheels to add weight and keep the nose planted. Others left their expensive new tractor sitting in the barn and hitched the horses back up. In cold weather, starting the engine was an ordeal all its own. Oil congealed on the cylinder walls. The clutch plate froze solid. Strong men took turns cranking the handle in shifts while someone else fiddled with the choke and ignition timing, sometimes for an hour or more. When nothing else worked, farmers built actual fires underneath the engine to warm the crankcase and gearbox. Open flames under a machine sitting on top of 21 gallons of kerosene. To be fair, they were warned. And yet, people kept buying them, because even with the flipping and the fires and the daily calls to the dealer, the economics were irrefutable. The Fordson cost less to own and operate than a team of horses. It freed 5 acres per animal from feed production. It worked at night. It worked in the heat. It didn't need 27 minutes of grooming every morning. It didn't eat all winter. And when you parked it, it stopped costing you money. That calculation, more than any advertising campaign or dealer promotion, is what ended the age of the horse. Ford was also exporting Fordsons to the Soviet Union, which became the single largest foreign buyer starting around 1919. Between 1921 and 1927, the Soviets imported over 25,000 units. They loved the machine so much, they featured it on propaganda posters and in paintings celebrating collective agriculture. Then, naturally, they cloned it. In 1924, the Leningrad factory Red Putilovite began producing the Fordson Putilovets, a direct copy. The Soviet versions had quality problems because their metallurgy and heat treatment were wrong. You can machine a gear to perfect dimensions, but if the hardness is off, it grinds itself to nothing. They sorted it out eventually. But the act of copying tells you everything about how important this machine was. The consequences back in America were staggering, and they went beyond just the horses. Horse and mule populations fell from over 25 million in 1920 to roughly 14 million by 1940 to about 3 million by 1960. 22 million animals gone in 4 decades. But the tractor didn't just replace horses, it replaced people. By increasing the productivity of a single farmer, mechanization made smaller farms uneconomical. Farms grew larger. Families that had worked the same 50 acres for generations found they couldn't compete. They sold out, moved to cities, found factory work. The tractor, more than any single government policy or economic trend, drove the great migration from rural America to urban America that defined the middle of the 20th century. The USDA published alarmed reports with headlines like "Horse Production Falling Fast" and "Shortage of Work Animals in Sight." Breeders were producing only half the replacement colts needed to sustain the population. The average age of remaining draft animals climbed from about 9 years in 1923 to over 12 and a half by 1935. They were aging out, and nobody was breeding replacements. The 93 million acres once dedicated to horse feed shrank to 4 million. All that freed land went to cash crops. The agricultural map of America was redrawn in a single generation. And Ford? He walked away. In 1928, he pulled Fordson production out of the United States entirely. He needed the Rouge factory space for the Model A automobile. Manufacturing moved to Ireland, then England. He just left the market he'd built and dominated for a decade, after destroying over 100 competitors, after transforming how a nation fed itself. He moved on. International Harvester surged into the vacuum with the Farmall, carefully developed since 1923. Where the Fordson could plow and run belt equipment, the Farmall cultivated row crops too. High clearance, adjustable tread, small front wheels for maneuvering between rows. It was the all-purpose tractor the industry needed. By 1928, Harvester held 55% of the market. John Deere's Model D started a 30-year production run. The industry rebuilt itself stronger and more innovative than before, standing on the wreckage Ford had made. Ford returned to American tractors in 1939, partnering with Northern Irish engineer Harry Ferguson to build the Ford 9N. Ferguson had spent 2 decades perfecting his 3-point hitch system. He'd first demonstrated it to Ford around 1920. Ford wasn't interested, not then. It took nearly 20 years. But when the 9N finally launched, it introduced the implement attachment standard that every tractor manufacturer on Earth still uses today. Ferguson's persistence, combined with Ford's manufacturing muscle, changed farming a second time. The Fordson Model F wasn't the best tractor ever made. It wasn't the most reliable, the most powerful, or the safest machine of its own decade. Decades later, the fictional Hoyt-Clagwell tractor on the television show Green Acres, which randomly exploded and dropped its rear wheels mid-scene, was a Fordson Model F. The writers barely had to exaggerate. Today, surviving Fordsons sit in museums, in private collections, and behind barns where they were parked 80 years ago and never moved again. The Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn still has the very first production model, serial number 1, which Ford gave to the famous botanist Luther Burbank as a gift. But legacy isn't about perfection. It's about impact. And if you want to understand the Fordson's impact, look at the numbers one more time. In 1915, there were roughly 600 gasoline-powered tractors on American farms. By 1920, there were hundreds of thousands. By the end of the decade, the horse was in irreversible decline as a source of agricultural power. One machine, sold at a price point that defied economic logic, had tipped the balance permanently. The Fordson proved that a machine could replace a living animal at lower cost, at greater speed, with less daily labor. It was the first tractor the ordinary farmer could afford, not the wealthy landowner, not the prairie wheat baron, but the guy working 50 acres with a family to feed and a mortgage to worry about. Ford democratized mechanized agriculture, the same way the Model T democratized personal transportation. That shift freed millions of acres for food production, displaced millions of draft animals, reshaped rural economies from coast to coast, and ultimately pushed millions of people off the land and into the cities where they became the industrial labor force that built 20th century America. Henry Ford said it plainly. I have followed many a weary mile behind a plow, and I know all the drudgery of it. He built the Fordson to end that drudgery. It worked. It worked in ways nobody fully predicted and at costs nobody fully calculated. The legacy is messy. The math is undeniable. But the 25 million horses that pulled America's plows in 1920 were gone within a generation. They never came back. The machine won. And there you have it. The tractor that changed American farming forever and nearly killed its creator's reputation in the process. If your grandfather had one of these, or you've spotted one rusting behind a barn somewhere, drop it in the comments. And if you made it this far, go ahead and subscribe. We do this every week.